Hello. We have a very special class today. Congressman John Yarmuth has kindly accepted our invitation to sit down with us for the next half hour to discuss some of the ethical concerns raised by the role of government in regulating, promoting, and partnering with business. I've put together a list of questions for the interview, but before we get started, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest. John Yarmuth represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he serves on the Committee on Budget and the Committee on Ways and Means, which is the oldest and often considered the most powerful committee in Congress. He served as president of the freshman class and was named 2007 Legislator of the Year by the Kentucky Reading Association, Outstanding New Member of Congress by the Committee for Education Funding, which is the largest nonpartisan education organization in the nation, and Best of Congress by Working Mother magazine. Though best known as founder and columnist for Leo, Louisville's alternative news weekly, Congressman Yarmuth's diverse career has included work in public policy, business, higher education, including right here at the University of Louisville, and healthcare. Congressman Yarmuth, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Andrea.
Well, if I may, let's just jump right in.
Sure.
Because we have limited time. So, one of the first case studies we discussed this semester was that of executive compensation. As a nation, we have decided that there is a floor below which wages should not be allowed to fall in order to prevent worker exploitation, namely minimum wage. Given that there isn't necessarily a strong correlation between executive compensation and company performance, as is evidenced by what's happened recently, do you think it's time to consider a ceiling on executive compensation? For example, in your opinion, should we cap the compensation of executives whose companies receive taxpayer bailout or stimulus monies?
Well, I don't think the cap is really the best way to handle what has become, in my opinion, an immoral system. I mean, the key element here is, first of all, we've had the greatest disparity between the wealthiest Americans and the average American we've had in our history. And now the top CEOs in the country make 300 and 400 times what their average employee does. 30 years ago, that was 30 times that ratio. So things have gotten out of whack. The real consideration, particularly when you're dealing with companies that have received taxpayer support, is that you can't allow compensation to be based on a method which rewards risk-taking that jeopardizes more than that company. What we've had in this country over the last decade is a compensation system where the companies can take risk. If they lose their bet, the taxpayers bail them out. Mm-hmm. And on the other end, if they win, the taxpayers don't get any benefit. So what we have to do, I think, in terms of compensation is make sure that whatever compensation system these companies have, it's based on sound performance measures and not based on, not giving them an incentive to take risks which not only jeopardize their company, but jeopardize the economic system as well. So caps, absolute caps, I think probably are something we don't want as a government policy to decide what the most money you can make, because ultimately, we could do it with a company, but then what does that mean for an actor or an athlete and so forth?
Good point. Yes.
So I don't think the government should be in the business of saying what's fair compensation, but we should not allow companies to set up incentives to take gambles that the company's not ultimately going to be have to pay for.
All righty. Very good. All right. Let's move on. Everyone seems to be concerned these days about the size of our national debt. At what point do you think the size of our national debt risks our ability to finance the infrastructure necessary to ensure the quality of life and social well-being of future generations?
Well, I think the question actually implies an important distinction. That is debt that's made to invest and debt that's made not to. We borrow every penny, essentially, these days that we spend in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mm-hmm. And those are dollars largely that are gone into the air. Now, it doesn't mean they're not important to our national welfare. Some are, some aren't. But you shoot a rocket off, there's no return on investment. You build a road, you build a bridge, you expand the energy grid, modernize the energy grid. Those dollars, even though leveraged or borrowed, can turn into multiple times that in terms of productivity and benefit to the country. So I think that there is a good case to be made that if we're borrowing money to finance infrastructure, again, expanding the energy grid, modernizing that, building, improving our roads, building schools, that's a justifiable way to increase the debt. Other ways are not so useful. Bailing out banks that jeopardize and rewarding them for risky behavior is something that we probably shouldn't do. So we're nowhere near the point at which we have an excessive level of debt in terms of our GDP and our economy and in terms of what other countries' ratios are. But we're on a course that probably within 20 years we would reach a point where our debt would be unsustainable. So right now in an economic downturn, we have to borrow money, we have to invest, we have to spend money to stimulate the economy. But we've got to, as soon as we are on the road to recovery and we see job growth and we're back to a stable current situation, we've got to start taking steps to reduce the deficit.
All righty, okay. We could ask which arose first, regulations or the violation of societal standards that resulted in their promulgation. Regardless, today we hear business leaders often complaining that there are too many laws, too many regulations, too many competitive restrictions on business. When is it appropriate to promulgate regulations, and can there be too many regulations?
I think there can be too many regulations. But we have to distinguish between our regulations that are designed to protect the public and those that are that in their application will discourage investment, discourage innovation. And that's actually not that hard a line to draw. And the pendulum swings back and forth in this country, and we rarely get it exactly right. But it's pretty obvious to most observers these days that the pendulum over the last 20 years swung dangerously to the laissez-faire end of the equation, and businesses were allowed to operate with no constraints on them. And when you combine that with essentially a total failure to enforce antitrust laws in this country, where institutions, companies can get so big and then be unregulated, they jeopardize not only their stockholders, but they jeopardize the entire economy. So regulation's important. Nobody would want to see the FDA go away, and we have food and drug, and nobody would want to see many of those, the Consumer Product Safety Commission go away. We need to protect the consumers. We're now working on regulations to protect them against financial abuse on credit cards and so forth. We passed some significant legislation this year. I think that's all appropriate. So I think we're moving the pendulum to the back toward a good balance of regulation without discouraging innovation and investment. The marketplace will tell us probably if we go too far.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. In your opinion, do corporate interests have undue access and influence over the legislative process? And if so, how do we correct this to ensure that the democratic process is not compromised? And if not, why does this perception persist in the eyes of so many people in our society?
Okay, well, the perception exists because it is true. I mean, corporations do have undue influence. Special interests do in this country. We have a political system that is financed largely by their contributions, and when you allow that much big money into the political system, financing not just campaigns of members of Congress, state legislatures, city councils, but also to create the lobbying organizations they have, the average American is just totally outgunned in the arguments. So, I mean, we're seeing that right now in the healthcare debate. I don't care what he says. Joe Lieberman has sold his soul to the insurance industry in his state. And he can make the argument that this is in his state, but a lot of people have insurance companies in their state. I have one in my district right here.
Yeah, certainly.
But there's so, if you look at the largest contributors to congressional campaigns over the last decade, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, and energy companies are the three biggest ones. Who's gotten the most breaks from federal policy? It is those three industries. So there's no question it happens. I'm a strong proponent of public financing of campaigns. I'm working to pass legislation. I don't know that it has much of a chance right now, but I tell every group, whether they're environmental groups or people who are interested in single-payer health care or many of the kind of the more progressive positions, I said, you need to spend as much passion as you do on your specific issue on public financing of campaigns, because otherwise the playing field will not be level. And so I'm strongly in favor of that. The other thing I just want to mention in conjunction with that statement, there's a case pending in the Supreme Court right now involving corporate expenditures directly on congressional races. And many people think the Supreme Court is going to eliminate any restrictions on corporations contributing to campaigns and advertising to beat candidates or support candidates. If that happens and there's no legislative response to it, we've destroyed democracy in this country. I firmly believe that, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. It will be disastrous for democracy. So I hope.
Do you have any idea when that decision will be?
It's going to come down pretty soon, because they are. I mean, it clearly will be. It'll come down in time to affect next year's elections. And just to give you an example of what could happen there, you could have a company that I don't want to give them any ideas, but. Well, let's take an example. Let's say that some drug company decides, that pharmaceutical company, that they want to send a message to any candidates. They could spend $50 million in one congressional district to beat one candidate and send a chilling message to every other candidate that if you don't vote the way they like, they're going to spend that much money against you. Again, that would have an unbelievably disastrous impact on democracy. So we're working to make sure that we have a proper legislative response to that if the Supreme Court does that. But in the context of your question, that's the biggest threat I see right now, much more so than the current law, which is bad enough.
Okay, all right.
On that optimistic
I'll have to keep my eyes open for that decision when it's handed down. Another question here. We have in place in America today the technological ability to reduce our overall energy consumption substantially. In fact, some experts estimate by as much as 80%. We have high mileage cars, super efficient heating and cooling systems, lighting technologies, and the list goes on and on and on. To what extent is the federal government actually incentivizing green innovation and green businesses and disincentivizing conducting business as usual?
Well, I think this is one of the, unfortunately, one of the unknown aspects of the stimulus bill that we passed this year. With that in conjunction with some other things we've done, made the largest investment by far in the history of this country in alternative and renewable energy research and development. And I mean, literally tens of billions of dollars are being invested now in research in those areas. So I think we're on the right foot. Ultimately, the marketplace is going to solve this problem for us, and it's happening. I mean, the way car manufacturers are responding to increased gas prices, all the alternatives. Ford Motor Company is working on 9 different technologies for more fuel-efficient vehicles. New companies are springing up. The electric car in California. The private sector is moving very quickly, and we're doing that. There are more people employed in the wind power business in this country than there are in coal.
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Which is, again, reassuring.
Yeah.
And so I think we're doing our part. We could probably do more. The energy bill that we passed earlier this summer that's now pending in the Senate, or perhaps better to say dying in the Senate.
Gasping for its last breath. Yes.
The major part of that bill was actually more incentives for research and development, and that was the cap and trade aspect of it was the most publicized, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars in additional money for alternative renewable sources and resources, and how to make fossil-based fuels more efficient and more environmentally friendly. So we're working on that. The president's committed to it. Secretary Chu is committed to that, and I think again that, and combining with the private sector's understanding that the future is there and that there's great money to be made.
So you think they do see the handwriting on the wall?
Absolutely, and I will tell you that a friend of mine had a conversation with the lobbyists for one of the largest energy companies in the world, one of the largest oil companies, and he told them they weren't going to go public with it yet, but they said, one, they know that they were wrong now on global warming, that they hired the wrong experts, that they now consider themselves a research company and not an oil company, and they are spending billions of dollars in other areas. So
it's quite a testament. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think of all the areas, the problems we have to deal with, I think there's reason for hope and optimism in that particular area, in energy and the environment, more than any other.
I'm already feeling better.
Good, good.
All righty. Often business operations move into and out of the U.S. to take advantage of the dollar and other currency fluctuations. Should American companies that set up operations abroad be required to comply with U.S. safety and environmental standards?
Well, yes, although that's easier said than done, and in some cases it gets pretty complex because in some countries, by requiring the same level of standards, you would actually be seriously harming the people of those countries and their economies. So you want to be careful not to be overly demanding of. Now we have laws about sweatshops and child labor in countries that we do business with, and I think we should never abandon those. We never want to do business with a country that endangers its workers or that exploits children or that exploits anyone.
Right.
But it's not as easy a call in every case to say, this country needs to adopt American standards because, first of all, it'd be impractical and not necessarily. They wouldn't have to do that to improve where they are. A lot of countries are really trying hard to improve their labor standards and their environmental standards, and they're going in the right direction. To make them make a quantum leap would not always be practical. So we need to keep pressuring them. We need to stand up in the UN and all the humanitarian organizations, keep fighting for it. But an absolute prohibition against doing business probably would be, in some cases, counterproductive.
Okay, all right, okay. In your opinion, do existing international trade agreements such as NAFTA and others work to the benefit of American workers? And do you think these agreements should be revisited?
I do think they should be revisited. It's pretty clear that NAFTA, for the most part, has been a net negative for American workers. Now, there are always two sides to that. The export business, in some cases, has benefited from these trade agreements. NAFTA has largely not been one. I mean, American agricultural organizations have been able to sell a lot of their produce to Central America. So it's been good for those producers, but that has really undermined the Central American economies. It's eliminated family farmers in Mexico and elsewhere. It's taken away the livelihood for a lot of people in those other countries. On the other hand, I was down in Juarez and El Paso last year, and American companies are literally moving just a mile or two across. Their executives, their managers still live in the United States, go across the border every day, and basically cut their labor costs by 50–60%, and then ship the products back into the United States without duty. So there's no question that it has cost a lot of jobs. It's been very damaging to areas in Kentucky, particularly in southern Kentucky. So,
are there particular industries in southern Kentucky that have been
well, the fruit
more
of the
adversely
loom,
impacted?
the fruit of the loom plant,
Okay.
the garment business has suffered dramatically. Again, we haven't been hurt by appliances. One thing that's interesting, though, we're starting to see it at Appliance Park, is that some of the companies are bringing jobs back into the United States from Europe, from Central America, even from China.
Because of the value of the dollar?
Because the value of
yeah.
the dollar has made the labor disparity different, and particularly in Europe now. So as we saw with Ford, they're planning to bring a German car back to the United States so they can make it here and ship it back to Germany.
It's quite a twist.
It is quite a twist. And in China, the question has been, yes, the wages are much lower, but the wage component of the cost of the product is actually very small. It might be 10% of the cost of the product, the actual labor component. So even though they save a lot of money, that's not their biggest thing. Meanwhile, they're shipping it all this way. They lose a certain amount of the products damaged en route, which because of the long thing, the cost of shipping and so forth. So some lines are coming back. So trade policy is not necessarily always the determining factor. There is just what you talked about, currency differential or other factors that make the manufacturing in another country less attractive now, less advantageous. But I do think we ought to look at NAFTA again and CAFTA as well. I think if I had been in Congress when NAFTA had been proposed, I would have voted for it because I thought the arguments were compelling. Having had the experience of the last decade and a half, I would say, in retrospect, it would have been a bad vote. I would not have voted for CAFTA for those same reasons.
I see.
I mean, our balance of payments with Canada has shifted by a factor of 10 since NAFTA went into effect, all to their advantage and to our disadvantage. So I think it would be good for us to review that.
Okay, all righty. When is it appropriate for government and business to partner with one another? And could you possibly give an example of a successful government-business partnership?
Well, there are actually an awful lot of situations in which government and business may not necessarily partner, but are part of a process where government does a certain amount of the work and then the private sector takes it on, or vice versa. And those have been very effective. I mean, actually, the pharmaceutical industry is a good example of that. The military has a research arm, Dharma, which has created an awful lot of new products which have then been taken by the private sector and used to expand the economy. Most of the research, the basic research on drugs in this country is done by government, either directly by a government unit or by colleges and universities, just like here at U of L. And that they do the formative work, and then the private sector takes it over, actually does the testing, and then markets the product. So there are a lot of situations like that seem to work out well for the economy and for creating jobs and so forth. It's not always appropriate. Right now, though, one area I don't think is appropriate, we're seeing in the military with subcontracting a lot of services to corporations. I mean, I consider that a partnership. We saw what happened with Blackwater and the security and the problems with them. We still have more private contractors in Afghanistan and Iraq than we have soldiers, and they're doing a lot of work that I think the American people probably would not want non-military personnel to do.
Sure.
So I think in those instances we're overpaying dramatically, and I'll give you one example in Iraq I know about. This is the former subsidiary of Halliburton, runs the security operation in Iraq, and say in the green zone, there's a security card. Everybody has a security card to go in and out and through buildings and so forth. Every time they swipe that card, it's $25.
Oh my goodness.
$25 to a private company that
just to go enter and exit.
Enter and exit. And we're paying for that. So those are the partnerships we need to, I think, review and audit and change if they're unreasonable. I think many of them are. So,
okay. All righty, thank you. Do you see any issues or potential problems with a handful of media conglomerates controlling the news and other programming? And if so, does government have a role in addressing these problems? And do you have any specific recommendations about how they might be best addressed?
Well, there are many aspects to that question. And having spent most of my professional life in the media, I'm particularly interested in that. First of all, I would say the mere concentration of media does not bother me at all, because we now have a much more diverse, dispersed, fragmented media than we've ever had. As a matter of fact, I think it's almost a problem that we don't have more concentrated media. When I was growing up, you were close to that. We had basically 3 networks,
Right.
a couple newspapers owned by the same family, and everybody had pretty much the same foundation of information. Now, so sometimes it was wrong, but we were all dealing with the same base of information. Now, with the internet and the cable and all the news networks and 24 hours and blogs, no two of us have the same information. And that makes it harder to get consensus on major policy questions. So I don't think concentration is a problem. Just because one company like Clear Channel has a lot of radio stations doesn't bother me. Rupert Murdoch has bought a lot of properties, but still there's plenty of competition for him. Again, on a historical basis, far more competition than there ever has been. That being said, the line between entertainment and news has been so blurred by the media, and the public's consumption standards have changed so much that we don't know anymore who's credible and who's not. The biggest problem is the American people don't know whether they should believe what they hear or read or not. And that's why Rush Limbaugh has an audience. That's why bloggers actually can sway an issue. Matt Drudge can drive public opinion, even though they're not vetted with anywhere near the same rigor that the old newspapers and wire services and so forth do. And of course, with the technology where you can actually fabricate so much, that's another issue. So I'm much more concerned about that. And I don't have an answer to it, but again, nobody's believable anymore.
You don't know what to believe.
You don't know what to believe. And I spend a lot more time than I should. People sending me crazy stuff that they got on the internet. I'm saying, where did you get this? This is totally made up. And I had a doctor in a big session on healthcare say, the bill says this, section such and such, section such and such. Aren't you concerned about that? And I said I would be if any of it were true. But it's not. And he said, well, I got this.
You would expect would be highly educated.
He said, I've got this on paper. I said, you got something you printed out off the internet. Look in the bill, see if you can find that, because it's not there. But, so that's my big concern about our contemporary media, is there's no vetting, there are no standards, and it's tough for the American people to know what's right and what's not.
That's terribly troubling, yeah. Okay, all right. Many businesses today are under intense pressure to either reduce or eliminate affirmative action policies or to reinforce those policies. In your opinion, do you think affirmative action is still needed in today's society?
That's a great question. I would not want to see it eliminated totally. Most enlightened companies, because of changing patterns and demographics and an increasingly tolerant country, have found it to their advantage to be diverse and to not discriminate. Most marketing has figured out that it's useful to encourage the biggest tent of customers. So I think society is handling most of that problem on its own. There are still, particularly I'm still concerned about education, the field of education and grad schools, and when the federal courts, basically in the Michigan case, set back affirmative action. I think that's had some adverse consequences. I know the situation in California, in Michigan, in Texas, and some places where there are significant minority populations, they're not reflecting themselves in student body enrollment. And so that area particularly concerns me. But again, just in the private sector, I think we pretty much resolve those problems. But again, I would not want to see affirmative action eliminated as an accepted public policy right now, because I think there's still some pockets of discrimination we need to worry about.
Okay, all righty. Paul Hawken, in his book, The Ecology of Commerce, draws a distinction between a growing economy, one that is measured strictly in quantitative terms, getting bigger size for the sake of size, and a developing economy, one that is measured in qualitative terms, getting better, helping people use fewer resources while improving their lives in the long run. Do you think that the health of our economy is too dependent on consumerism and growing the GDP rather than emphasizing how and what we do produce?
Yes, I do. Now, again, like everything else, it's a complicated subject. You can see right now, in the third quarter of this year, we had a growth in GDP of 3.5%. Everybody says, isn't this great, the economy's back growing again. Well, jobs aren't being created. Most of that increased business is going to the wealthiest people. It's not finding its way to the average American. That's that great disparity of wealth we have now, where a small percentage of the American people now control 95% of the wealth of the country.
Right.
So GDP measures and the way Wall Street the Dow Jones and how Wall Street prospers, and the profit of Goldman Sachs are measures of something, but they should not be the measure of how our economy is doing. And I think that's the implicit question, implicit in the question. Until we improve the standard of living of every American, until we start to narrow that disparity, that gap between the haves and the have-less, we are not going to have the right kind of economy. And this is the whole question of economic justice. And the question of how consumerism fits into that is a different issue. We need to try to encourage, and I don't know whether this is government or just talking to one another, we need to encourage the kind of consumption that is productive, doesn't harm the environment, that is healthy. We don't need to encourage the consumption of more video games. We don't need or things that don't add value to society or to the human
disposable products that wind up in the landfills and depleting the resources, polluting the environment, etc.
If we can't improve the human condition with consumerism, then we don't want a consumer-driven economy. But if we're consuming because we're putting solar panels on our houses, or we're insulating our homes, or we're doing things, that's the right kind of consumption. And again, I don't know how much public policy at least government policy can affect that, but it's something we need to work toward.
Okay, following up, and this gets us into some of what's been happening lately. Our healthcare system is a growth industry primarily because of its overwhelming reliance on technology and pharmaceuticals. In essence, the system needs to treat sickness in order to make money. A healthy person doesn't contribute to the system that we have here today. It may seem obvious, but with all the news coverage of the healthcare reform debate, there has been relatively little emphasis placed on the importance of maintaining health rather than treating illness. Do you see this as a problem? And if so, wherein lies the problem? A deficiency in the debate itself or in the news coverage of the issue?
Yes, I see it as a huge problem. It is probably the number one problem facing our healthcare condition right now, and looking forward. The two biggest problems we have in healthcare in this country are things that public policy can't affect. One is end-of-life decisions and end-of-life care. I don't even want to get into that right now. But the other one is basically personal conduct and healthy conduct. And we try in the legislation that we've passed in the House now to pay more attention to preventive care and wellness. We know we we set the mechanism in motion for changing the way we compensate providers in the system, to change the way we compensate physicians. Right now, we're in a fee-for-service system, which pays doctors for what they do, the processes, the procedures they perform, the equipment that they use on you, the drugs they give you. You mentioned those in the question, instead of paying them for keeping you healthy.
Right.
Part of there are all sorts of reasons for that, but we need to change that system. We don't know exactly what the best way to do it is, but most other countries who have far more efficient and productive healthcare systems than we do and spend less, concentrate on keeping you well. And the physicians are rewarded for keeping you well and not for, again, treating you for when you get sick. So we try to set that process in motion to find a better way to compensate people, doctors, and in this system. So it's a huge problem. Personal conduct is something that I don't know exactly how we get at, but Americans are Americans. We want to
And Kentuckians are Kentuckians.
Yes, we want to eat whatever we want to eat, drink whatever we want to drink, smoke whatever we want to smoke, engage in any risky behavior you want to, and then we want the best care in the world and not pay for it.
And we want a magic bullet to cure us, yes, and not pay for it, right.
Exactly. So, and of course, all these other industries, the fast food industry and so forth, they're trying to be healthier, partially for social responsibility, partially because they know it's good business, but there's still, we leave to too many Americans very few options as to their proper diet.
Right, right.
And we need to do a better job on that.
Despite all of the money we throw at it in terms of research and development and treating sickness, we're still some of the most unhealthy people in the industrialized world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the personal behavior is the biggest factor in diabetes and in heart disease.
Right.
It's a large factor in cancer, with smoking particularly. If we could end diabetes, we solve our long-term health care financing problems. It's that expensive to the system.
Yeah.
Human behavior is a really critical part of that.
Sure. Last question here. What's your opinion of a flat tax or a consumption tax?
Great question. The flat tax I'm very much opposed to.
Okay.
Because people don't have any idea how much their taxes would go up if we had a flat tax. I've read the flat tax book, and it essentially would mean that everybody would pay somewhere in excess of 30% of their income in tax. That's far more than the average American pays now. I know Americans think they're overtaxed, and many of them are, but we still pay, in total, a lot lower tax rate than any other industrialized nation. Flat tax would raise the taxes of virtually every American. So I'm against that.
As would, I guess, most Americans be
Yeah,
against it if they realize
so.
that.
They think
okay.
it's simple. I know there's a great deal of appeal to saying you just pay X percent and you don't have to file the tax returns and so forth and so on. But it works out if you try to replace the income at all levels. Remember, you're not just talking about federal government. You got state income.
Right.
You have a lot of different levels of government that rely on tax revenues. So to get all of that done, it would put people's tax, even though I'd pay a 17% federal tax, even though most people would pay a far greater tax. But they would pay, that's more than they pay now. But then state tax is not going to go away, local tax is not going to go away.
Additional taxes. And
The idea of a consumption tax, again, if you're talking about in terms of replacing income tax with a consumption tax, I'm against that as well because it's a very regressive tax. In other words, you have somebody who makes $1 million a year, they could end up, just because they may not have extravagant lifestyle, they may end up paying 10% tax because they only spend a certain amount, and they may spend a couple $100,000. They pay whatever the tax would be, and that's it. And so. But somebody who spends all of their income, which is basically most Americans,
right.
They would be paying a greatly disproportionate share of their income. So,
Could you exempt certain items?
well, you
from,
could,
yeah.
you could. I mean, you'd have to exempt food and so forth. But then
Right.
again, you get into very high tax rates on other stuff if you do it. Again, if you're talking about replacing the federal income tax, we talked about actually some kind of consumption tax as a way to pay for health care. And eventually we may end up doing something like that, 1% or 0.5% or something. But again, that's just for one specific project. If you're trying to replace all corporate tax and all income tax with a consumption tax or a flat tax, I think most Americans would see a pretty steep increase in their taxes and wouldn't be happy about it.
Balk at it immediately. All righty. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I cannot tell you how very much I appreciate your being here. You've been very generous with your time and information.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you'll consider coming back sometime in the future.
I love coming to your classes.
Oh, you're sweet. All righty. Until next time.